Hello, welcome to Jordan Sorcery's GW Books Club. Today we're talking about 1989's Warhammer Fantasy novel Zaragoz, written by Brian Craig, the pen name of Brian Stableford. This is the first novel in the Orfeo trilogy, a set of stories from the earliest times in the Warhammer fiction universe that explore corners of the old world that we don't really see that often. Before my friend Stu and I start talking about our experiences reading this book, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the story. On a voyage to Araby, the ship carrying Master Minstrel Orfeo is savaged by pirates. The minstrel and a young cabin boy are taken prisoner, seemingly the only healthy survivors, and they expect their future to be one that is sold into slavery. But as luck would have it, their captor, Al-Qadi Nazreen, the Lord of the Twin Seas, takes an interest in Orfeo's storytelling skills, and upon hearing that the player recently travelled through his homelands in Estallian, the pirate demands a story of the great and terrible dukedom that he once called home, the city of Zaragoz. Orfeo is a master storyteller, and he regales the pirate king with richly drawn details of his time in the mountaintop city. As he arrived near the foot of the crag, he happened upon a priest who was beset by blackguards. After fighting them off, Orfeo wins the gratitude of this priest, a man who worships the gods of law and goes by the name of Arcangelo. They finish their journey into the city together, and they take lodgings in a tavern. And it's in that tavern that Orfeo steps in to protect an innocent from some angry off-duty guardsmen. But the timely arrival of two young noblemen prevents any bloodshed. Orfeo earns an invitation from one of these nobles, Rodrigo Cordova, to play music for the cream of Zaragozian society. And from there, Orfeo increasingly finds himself drawn into the intricate political dynamics and history of this city. Despite warnings from his new friend Arcangelo and from the dangerous sorcerer Semyaza, Orfeo reluctantly becomes a champion of Cordova and an enemy to the city's Duke Marsilio de Avila. Slowly, it becomes apparent that de Avila and many of the ruling nobles are in league with chaos, tapping into the ruinous powers to indulge their own fantasies and excitements. Orfeo is tortured and imprisoned, but through Arcangelo's magical aid, he is able to escape from the dungeons through the very mountain on which Zaragoz is built, though not before encountering unusual ape-like creatures and almost dying in the total darkness. In a final confrontation at the festival known as the Night of Masks, the young noble Rodrigo loses a duel against the superior swordsman, the Duke, and though Rodrigo yet lives, all still seems lost. Until that is, the product of a desperate dark deal made between the priest of law Arcangelo and the very forces of chaos takes effect. Arcangelo has sold his own soul for help in bringing down the rulers of Zaragoz, and a flood of rats and chaos creatures streams through the fortress, destroying the evil sorcerer Semyaza and the Duke de Avila. Plus, someone steps on Orfeo's lute. Back in the prison in Araby, Orfeo finishes his tale and wins his freedom. The pirate lord of the Twin Seas has heard all that he needs from this story. Now he finally knows what became of his corrupted brother, the evil wizard Semyaza. Stu, what did you think of the overall read of Zaragoz? Did you enjoy reading this book? How did you feel about this story?
I did enjoy reading it. Yes, I was a little bit concerned going into it, partly because of the short story in in Ignorant Armies was probably one of my least favorites, and I was a little bit concerned about the style and whether how it would work for a full length Warhammer novel. But I'm also, we talked about this a little bit before, enjoying the progress or the process of discovering these books for these videos and for the whole book club thing. So it adds a different element to it. So I tend to look at the book and the whole process in a slightly different way than I would be if I was just picking up the book to read, just for my own enjoyment. So I did enjoy the book. There were at points in the book where I felt it was maybe felt a little bit slow, or was a little bit unsure about where it's going, or I question things. But most of those things sorted themselves out later on. So I think I questioned the whole prologue setup and how it sort of seemed to overly labor the way the story was going to be told. It was almost a conversation between the characters. I mean, I'm going to tell it. Why are you telling the story from third person? Well, I'm going to tell it that way because it makes more sense. I was like, I was questioning at the time, do you need that explanation as part of the story? Surely as the reader would work that out, and it felt a little bit odd. So from early on, I thought it's a little bit strange and a little bit slow, but I was interested to keep delving back in and reading more and more chapters and wanting to know what happened. But I wasn't gripped all the way through. It wasn't a kind of desperate to know what happened. I was interested to know what happened.
Yeah, I mean,
and there were some really interesting chapters, but it was the
for
flow
sure.
was different. The pace changed throughout the book quite a lot. And we'll discover that more a little bit later on. But what
Yeah.
about you?
I enjoyed it overall, and I think I totally agree about this as a process. So the book club and reading one book a month through this sort of chronology of the original GW books release. So having that context and looking back through time at this version of the Warhammer world that didn't exist hasn't existed for many years, doesn't exist anymore, and it's kind of looking at how they were starting to put more flesh on the bones of the Warhammer world, if you like. So that's been a really interesting part of it. On its own merits, I similarly had a bit of concern going in, and that was, the opening sort of framing device and some of the way it was written and some of what the story looked like it was going to be about. It did give me a bit of pause where I was like, okay, I don't know if I'm feeling this. And the earliest stuff in Estallian, where you're sort of finding out a little bit about this place that we haven't really seen much other fiction about in the Warhammer world,
Yeah.
that world building didn't fill me with confidence, I guess, early on, because
Yes.
it didn't immediately grab me. I mean, I'm not that familiar with it as a part of the setting, and the book didn't hold my hand and sort of introduce me to that world either. It was
Yeah.
just this kind of landscape against which a character was moving. So yeah, I did have some concerns early on, but then as it sort of progressed, I did really get into it, and I did start to really enjoy the story, and the world building stopped being a problem for me, and it kind of sort of my interpretation of how this world works and why he's telling the story in this particular way sort of changed over time, which I thought was really interesting. And we'll probably get to this later on. That framing device of the storyteller regaling his captor with a story of his own past. There's something interesting in that when you compare it to Drachenfels, I think, which is
Yeah.
also a story that has a framing device and looks through time, and you've got these multiple layers of meta plot and narrative that's happening in different ways at the same time. So I thought that as a comparison to that, there's some really interesting stuff here. I don't know why the first two novels in the Warhammer world have this kind of meta sort of interpretation of storytelling as a thing and the theater of storytelling. So I'm sure there's some more adept literary critics than me will probably be able to make lots of hay out of that. But I thought it was just an interesting thing to see.
Do you think they had? Do you think they felt they had room writing for GW that they felt maybe wouldn't be seen by many of their regular readers for their other fiction? Do you think they felt they had room to play around a little bit and
Potentially, yeah, it could
test
well
stuff
be
out
that.
and do things
Yeah,
that maybe seem risky? I say that having not read any of their work outside of the GW fiction, so maybe that's unfair to them. But I do wonder whether they felt like riffing a bit here. We kind of have a go. So
but
you
certainly
mentioned about
possible.
the world building, and I felt, and it's an assumption, but that there was deliberately absolutely no attempt made to do any kind of world building. And I've been told this about the Warhammer world. I've read first edition Warhammer Fantasy. This is Spain.
Sure.
And I just need to tell the story as if it's Spain. And you see that with Arabo as well. And I felt like 90% of the novel, so you take away the magic and you take away the chaos side, which is in many ways very subtle till the end, and then it's different, and again that's another big thing to talk about.
Yeah.
But the rest of it could have been an historical novel, and
Yeah.
even with the limited magic in there, it becomes a historical fantasy, doesn't it? So you've got very almost low fantasy in that sense. And the magic wasn't too strong. There's no other races. There's nothing else in there. And you could set it in Madrid in the 1600s, and it
Yeah,
would work. Much of the novel would just work.
you're dead right.
Change.
Yeah,
It,
yeah, of course.
it,
I
it
mean,
feels
even
like things I've watched. Even the scenes, it doesn't even have to be that period. Even the scenes in Arabe, and it reminded me of reading early Sharp novels when he's in
right.
India, and he's a captive of the Tipu Sultans and things. There's so much of that stereotypical kind of
Yes, which
Eastern feel,
is
all of these
present.
things that go into that, and
Yeah,
which is what Warhammer is really. It's one
yeah,
big. It's
certainly early
developed and
on,
changed over time,
of
but yeah,
course.
so
Yeah,
it felt like it was just
yeah,
there's no attempt because they felt it's not needed because people are just going to picture Spain, people are just going to picture north of Africa and the Middle East, and it doesn't matter.
yeah. I think you're right, and there's that because those early ranges in the Warhammer world, because they were using other Citadel ranges that already existed. Oh, you've already
Mm.
got your samurai. Oh, well, there's a place called Nippon, so that just explains why there's a load of samurai
And
miniatures on the
historical
table.
miniatures as well. A
Yeah,
lot of it
exactly.
were ranges. I think weren't a lot of the Bretonnians just sculpts that were made for historical ranges as well. They
Absolutely, yeah,
just
early on
said,
for
we've already
sure.
got these will do.
Yeah,
Put these
it's
men.
completely that. That's a huge part of it. And you're right. He's been given the brief that okay, well, where do you want to set this? Or he chose to set it in Estallia because it wasn't explored, or whatever the reason it's set there. He's then gone, yeah, it's Spain. We're going to do Zaragoza, and we're going to make it Zaragoz, and then we're just going to
Yeah.
tell this story. And the place it's set is kind of largely irrelevant in terms of
Mm-hmm.
the nature of this place. You don't learn very much about what it's like to live in Estallia. You don't
No,
learn very much about what it's like to live in Zaragoz, even outside of some
no.
of the noble houses. Like, what's the regular life of a person who
Yeah.
lives, a
There's not much
peasant?
visual description, is there?
Not really at
There's
all,
very
no.
little.
And so that's why I was kind of worried early on because the story it brings us in. So you've got that sort of elaborate opening where yes, our hero Orfeo is captured and he's now going to tell a grand story of his past and somewhere he's been, and his captor, the Lord of the Twin Seas, wants to know of Zaragoz. So it's this really dramatic like starting point. And then the story that he then starts telling is, yeah, it's not to be, I don't want to be overly critical, but it's almost a bit pedestrian. It's just a guy
Mm.
wanders into a city, he saves some random dude from some like vagabonds and rough guys who are trying to rob him, and from there the story then sort of starts to pick up speed. But because we don't really learn much about the place, I don't even
Yeah.
remember if we learned like the name of the tavern off the top of my head. I can't remember because I've been writing down the names of the
You
taverns from
have. I
the
was
other
gonna say
books,
if anyone
and I
would
don't
know, it
remember
would be
writing
you.
one down for this. And that could just be my memory. But there's that kind of thing where you don't get that sort of feel of the world in the way that you did in Ignorant Armies and many of the stories
Yeah.
in that, and in Dragonfels for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where it sort of turned around for me was that because this story is so focused on the sort of politics and the machinations of these particular noble houses, and then it's also quite a, like you say, subtle story of chaos and the seduction of chaos. And I mean, I don't even know if they actually use the term chaos. I can't remember that, maybe once or twice, but
Yeah,
it's
I think
very
so. Yeah.
light touch. But because this is a corner of the Warhammer world that's just not that interesting. And the reason we know it's not that interesting is because it's not in many stories. It doesn't have an army. It doesn't turn up in all of the fiction. It doesn't turn up in all of the games and the lore and stuff. Because actually, we've been told by the creators of Warhammer and the people who worked on it for 40 years that nothing very interesting happens there.
Yeah.
And that's the reason that there's no stories that are set there. So to then have a story where actually we're seeing how pedestrian the world is there, and actually what makes it interesting to these people and the players in this story is that they can then be seduced by chaos, because that's what then is the sort of point of interest for them, that sets
Yeah.
it apart from a typical place. Now maybe I'm being a bit generous and kind of making it work for me and making the world and the sort of plainness of this place more interesting so that I can enjoy the story more. But ultimately, it kind of didn't matter once the story got going for me because there were some interesting things happening.
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree. Yeah, I'd agree with most of that. I think in terms of it not being an interesting place, it just feels like a place they've not covered. They've not put the time into it. And it could be interesting if they wanted to make it
Sure.
interesting.
Yeah.
But because there's no kind of emphasis on it as an interesting place, it's very easy for an author to come along, especially a contracted author that doesn't really have any sort of grounding to go, was it based on, oh, like Spain, is it? Okay, so I can just use standard tropes from real history rather than
Yeah.
trying to develop anything beyond that. It doesn't have any extra character to it. So the empire, yes, we recognize it as a sort of medieval to early modern Germany, but then over the years much more flavors been added to it as well to make it a little bit more quirky, and that's, but it's still essentially that at its core. And I suppose Stalia could be the same. You just not been
For
developed.
sure.
So it's not that it's not interesting. It's just that no one's put any time into developing some extra interest there. Is there
Yeah.
something you mentioned in the live stream was about, like, one of the reasons always given for Warhammer going is because they ran out of room to grow it, which is not true. It's a reason you could say, but clearly there's so much of the world that's on the map that's not been explored, and you could spend an awful lot of time exploring those and growing that game. The biggest problem, I think, is so much of it does resemble too closely our real world, which meant that it was hard to IP stuff, isn't it?
Certainly, yeah. Yeah. And
or
that's obviously,
go down
yeah.
tropes and things that are difficult
Yeah.
in the modern world, and should be difficult. The things you need to be careful with.
Yeah. And I
So
was quite
there's reasons for it.
surprised in the storytelling and the sort of, I guess I don't know if it's a modern way of world building. I'm sure lots of authors have done it, Tolkien and others. But like when you would have what you might have expected, or at least I expected, was that Orfeo, when he's talking about these things that he's done, these places he's been, and he'll be telling stories, that's when you might then have him name drop. Oh, and then there was an ogre or a minotaur or a beast man, or I fought some goblins or some orcs, or those that's where you just get those little bits of like the herbs and spices being scattered over the story that then makes
But
it
there's none of
feel
it apart
Warhammer.
from wood
Not
elves.
really, yeah.
Are wood elves the only non-human race mentioned in the book?
Possibly. I mean, you get demons of a kind,
Mm.
right? And then there's the surprising stuff in the caverns beneath the actual
Yes,
Zaragoz
but that
city
aren't really
itself.
a Warhammer race.
Not at all, yeah, which was a
So
very
rather than
interesting
use
use of
one,
itself, yeah.
we'll make something else up.
Yeah, and I kind of thought that was okay. Here we go. We're going to get Skaven now. This is going to be rat men
Yeah.
turning up and getting involved because the initial descriptions when they're down in this cave, it's pitch black. There's some creature there that's furry and that's following
Yeah.
the hero.
Well, that's what it should have been.
It could have been.
And a
It certainly
Warhammer
could.
focused
It certainly could
editor
have been.
would have said, like what you're doing, by the way, you've got to make those Skaven.
Yeah, but then these kind of
Don't
weird
make up another
small
race.
sort of these underground kind of ape men who actually did attack these albino ape guys. They could have ended up being a new Warhammer race if things had gone a
Yeah.
different way, for all we knew. But yeah, so you get these kind of things. But then actually, like I say, that kind of it created this real feeling of Estalia in the Warhammer world, this place being quite foreign and different. And one of the reasons they don't have armies and they don't get involved with all of this stuff is because their experience of the Warhammer world is so different to what you would experience if you lived in Kislev or if you lived in the Empire, because you're not constantly facing beastmen and you're not constantly facing orcs and goblin raids and
They must be, though, to say, not beastmen maybe, but if you look where they are on the map, they're only sort of a mountain range west of east, sorry, of the Border Princes, aren't they? So
yeah, but you don't. But the Empire seems to draw the ire of chaos more than anywhere else, right?
yeah,
And so people,
chaos wise, but other races, I just assume, again, it's an assumption because they've not written enough about it, but I just assume that they did deal with those things to a certain extent. Maybe not chaos. Well, chaos are in the books, obviously chaos, but they did deal with orcs and goblins
Yeah,
They did,
probably, but
but
there's
it's
just
just no one's told those stories. So I assume that
yeah,
they were happening, but there's just no one's told those stories, and there's no nod to them in this story. And
yeah.
I think it would
It
have
certainly
helped
could be that, yeah.
place it within the Warhammer world if there was at least a hint to the city was last, attacked by the goblin in the goblin walls of 2470, whatever.
Yeah.
That kind of thing would have made it feel more Warhammery, and you could have handled that quite easily with a few lines here or there. I think would have made
Yeah.
a huge difference to the book without
Which
changing the
is
story.
true, yeah, and it definitely has that. So this was like an obstacle for me getting into it originally, early on, because precisely this, where it just didn't feel quite Warhammery, and the nature of the story was like, well, is this going to tell a Warhammer story? And I don't even know what a Warhammer story is, but I want it to feel to do
Yeah.
this weird, ineffable sort of Warhammer-ness that I wanted from it. But when I was able to get past that, that's when I did actually start enjoying the book for itself, I think. I
Yeah.
mean, what did you think of like
So
the story itself? So Orfeo telling the tale of Zaragoz, telling the tale of Rodrigo Cordova, this noble who may have some fate that
mhm.
is going to be important to Zaragoz and is going to save Zaragoz and bring justice to this place. And there's wizards and there's an evil lord who rules over his people. We never see how he rules over his people, but
No.
presumably, given that he's got some sort of subtle deal with chaos, it's not great. What was that story like for you as a
I think it was fine. I think the
yeah.
actual idea, the outline of the story was absolutely fine. So probably a bit like you in that sense, is that the story was good enough that I wanted to know what happened.
Hmm,
There was enough of when you started getting, especially the second part of the book, because it's split into parts. Actually, that second part of the book, once you start having characters introduced like Morella, when you're starting to see the kind of the chaos links and things, it did start then to feel like the Warhammer of its era, which is what we're talking about. We're talking about that first edition Warhammer Fantasy roleplay era. It did feel like the kind of characters you might meet in those kind of adventures and those stories, and even just slightly the kind of things you might see in Gotrek and Felix, which is of that era as well, the original stories. So it did feel a bit like that old Warhammer then, but before that point, like no, it probably didn't, because it could have been set, like I said before, in a historical Spain. But the story in itself, the idea of the story is absolutely fine, and some bits are really, really nicely written as
hmm,
well. And it did, like, I think you mentioned this on a stream a bit about it. It did have an unusual pace to it at times, and I think that pace
sure.
changed a little bit throughout the story, and it's an unusual tone to it. I don't know how to explain that very well, but it
Yeah.
definitely it felt that the way that the prose were written put an unusual narrator in my head, as opposed to some other books. It did feel kind of almost like it was written in a more scholarly way than some Warhammer style novels.
Hmm,
Yeah, so I like the story's fine. I didn't not enjoy the story at all. It was good, but I felt that adding a few more flavorful bits in it could have made it really, really good. If that
yeah.
makes sense. And I think that if you compare it with Drachenfels, that was enough Warhammery in flavor in Drachenfels to give another unusually written book, made it much, much better, I think.
Yeah.
And for me, that was one of the key differences, is that the flavor and that almost the effort. It's really, I don't know the author, but I just get the impression he just wrote the story he wanted to write, and it didn't really matter
Well,
what
I mean, we're
the
going to get to
setting
know
was.
the
And
author Brian Craig quite well because
we
he's done
are.
a fair few of the
So
stories that we're going to be
we will
reading.
see.
But like,
I
I
haven't
thought,
looked into interviews.
no, I mean, I've
Has he
not.
given interviews on it?
I don't know
Do you know?
actually. Yeah, I'm not sure, and I've not
Interesting.
read any of his other work outside of the GW books. So Brian Stableford is his real name. Brian Craig
Yes.
was
Yeah.
his pseudonym for the GW books. Obviously, he writes the Orfeo trilogy, so there's two more stories with Orfeo to come, and there's some short stories as well. I thought there was quite so, so the Orfeo storytelling aspect actually came together for me quite well, because I think that that's how you can start to explain certain aspects of like what detail is left out and he would
Mhm.
expect someone to already know, and he's only interested in the sort of the political machinations of these houses and the stuff that happens with Arcangelo, the wizard of law, and
Yeah.
Semyaza, the wizard of chaos.
Yes.
He's sort of very focused on those particular things because that's the story he's chosen to tell as a sort of minstrel or a
Yes.
dramatist telling the story. And I think that there's, because again, comparing it to Drachenfels, where Drachenfels is propelled forward by this almost serial killer like story happening in the background and some of the political stuff as well that's on top of it. This has got the political stuff. It doesn't have quite a stronger sort of propulsion
Hmm.
engine, for want of a better
Yeah.
phrase, because you're kind of just Orfeo's just slowly gets involved. He doesn't really
Yeah.
want to. And there's quite an interesting scene early on where he gets interrogated by Semyaza, the evil wizard, and Semyaza can tell whether he's lying. And he's like, I don't want to, I'm not here to get involved. I don't care about any of this. I'm just here to make some money and sing some songs.
Yeah.
And Semyaza's like, yeah, he's right. He's telling the
Yeah.
truth. And that's interesting. So that plays quite well. And then he's almost radicalized in the story to then get involved
Yes.
because his friend is going to be attacked and stuff. So there is quite a natural evolution of Orfeo's involvement. But because Orfeo, our protagonist, doesn't want to be involved, and we're not
Yes.
really given much information about any of the people who are involved, it's a bit harder to then be like, well, I'm now invested in what's going to happen here. Because it's quite a nebulous threat.
Yeah. He keeps removing the jeopardy, doesn't it? So
Yeah, a little
if
bit.
that was
Yeah.
a film, Semyaza would not have believed him. The pressure would have been there right away, because as soon as you say, "Oh, I believe you," they're like, "Oh, okay, what's happening?" And because, like you said, Orfeo doesn't really want to be involved. Genuinely, he keeps saying it. It's not like he's pretending. In a film, he would pretend he didn't want to be involved,
Hmm.
but in this story, he genuinely doesn't want to be involved. So again, it's like, oh, okay, so he's not, because you're seeing it from his point of view. You're only seeing what he knows and what he sees, and that
Yeah.
takes away some of that scene setting detail, I suppose, that kind of
Yeah.
that
And I think,
context of the city and the
yes, that's it. The context of the city, because we don't know, the stakes are never sort of explained in what bad thing would happen if Marsilio de Avila, the presumably evil ruler of the city, if he stays in charge, what bad things will happen?
yeah,
And if Rodrigo Cordova takes over, what good things will happen? It's never explained. So the
yeah,
actual outcomes, the things that are at stake, sort of aren't really there. All we get is Arcangelo, the wizard of law or the priest of law, talks about justice must be sort of fulfilled, and he is like a zealot for law and justice, and he's very much, these guys are bad. We need to do, like, something must take place, and there's this kind of feeling that both wizards, good and bad, have about Orfeo, that maybe he has a greater role to play. Maybe he's a little bit magic. Maybe that time with the wood
yeah,
elves in his youth has done something, or what, we don't know. But they want Orfeo involved. Orfeo's not interested, and we are never given a reason to be quite so interested. So
yeah,
it is a bit of an odd way to structure the novel, I would say,
yeah.
like in
Because
that
who
sense.
else thinks they're bad? And because we don't meet the regular people, we
Yeah,
don't know if they are oppressed.
yeah.
And the Duke's quite pleasant.
He seems
To,
he
in
seems
it.
pretty cool.
He's
Yeah,
pretty not until they all seem pretty nice until there's chance that the status quo might be changed, and that's
yes,
when they're forced into action. But without it seems okay. There's little hints, isn't there, about in the past, the change of the houses who were in charge of the city, that maybe people don't talk about that now because it was a dark time.
mm,
But beyond that, yeah, you don't get the impression that he's taxing everyone to the high heavens, that people are poor and destitute, and then what, where is the corruption? There's
yeah,
no financial corruption. It doesn't appear, does it? The corruption is much more subtle. It's almost it's a secret. It's a secret corruption, rather
yeah,
than chaos has driven this man to evil. He wants to dominate. He's got the desire to go forth and take other lands. The actual potential evilness is much more quiet and subtle beneath the scenes.
yeah,
And it's more about, if you don't really know what's going on, what harm is it causing? So
Yeah, and
again,
we
it's
know.
that interesting, isn't it? It's well,
Yeah,
only because we know about chaos from a Warhammer
yeah.
perspective. You take that, oh, if you were a reader who doesn't know about chaos from a Warhammer perspective, what would you think was going on?
Yeah, exactly. And but then I think so. I think that yeah, I totally agree. And there's a certain it is interesting in that that is the case. We don't know whether these guys are bad or people see them as bad. Is it just the fact that they've done a deal with chaos that makes them bad? And actually, should that be that's enough for them to be
Mm,
like they should be ousted as a result of that? Because anybody who would do any kind of deal with chaos is a bad person and therefore should be out. Now like I say, we know that because we know what chaos actually is going to do in the Warhammer world. In the story, they don't use chaos for anything other than sort of personal benefit, which doesn't seem to have too much of a cost on anybody else. You only see chaos used by Morella, who
yeah,
uses it to seduce Orfeo, but actually Orfeo was interested already, so she doesn't.
yes.
It's still a
Don't know whether she seduced him or not.
yeah. Probably
She
she probably
uses
seduced him
magic to
naturally and then
enhance
enhanced. Yes,
things,
yeah, yeah,
but
absolutely.
it reads like a sex on drugs kind of scene as much
It
as it
does.
would by the god of Slanesh, and Slanesh didn't exist then.
Right, right,
I don't think so. I picked up this to have a little look because I was interested.
right.
So you've got 210. So I was interested in the priest of law because I thought I'm not
Sure,
familiar
yeah,
with the
like
priest of
full
law.
canon. Yeah,
So 210, and you've got, sorry, completely ruining the flow now, but gods of law, there's 3, and gods of chaos, there's 3, and the gods of chaos are Khorne, Nurgle, and Malal at that stage.
right.
And the gods of law are Luminous, Arakana, and Solkan. So it makes you wonder whether he just opened that one page and thought,
Well, I
and
mean, there's some
thought, well,
interesting.
we've got a priest of law, and the evil wizard was maybe just a priest of chaos, generic chaos. I'm not
Yeah.
suggesting that's what he did, but he could have.
What
And
what I
there's
will
not
say
much more depth into it than that's found on that one page.
is keep an eye out for on the channel Jordan Sorcery, because we're going to be talking about chaos and its history in the Warhammer world, and we're going to be talking about magic and its history in the Warhammer world. But yeah, I think it is of a version of chaos, and where law is way more present, is more of a thing as a power in the
Yeah,
Warhammer world. Like it's in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It's never really present on the battlefield in Warhammer Fantasy
yeah,
Battle. Just as a side point, I actually find that a strength of its world building again, because
mhm,
Estallia actually there's people in Estallia who are super devout believers in the gods of law, and that is their religion, and that's really important. But those are old gods who basically have no power in the Warhammer world anymore. But there's still people clinging to that
yes, yeah,
because
yeah,
it's a place that is, again, irrelevant to a large extent. It doesn't have any power, and part of the reason it has no power and it's not important is because they're still doing all of this stuff that's gives them
I
no
agree,
power
actually.
anymore.
And I do like that. I wouldn't change the priest of law. I quite like that. And looking that up was, it's quite interesting.
Mm.
And I mean, I'm making a joke of it. I'm being a little bit flippant. And I don't know when was that role play book written in conjunction with this? It was a few years before. So maybe
Yeah.
Slanesh had been released by then.
Well,
It's just not in the original edition of
I mean,
Fantasy
we do
Roleplay.
see
I
demonettes
mean,
of
if Slanesh
Slanesh.
hasn't been released by then, it makes you wonder even more about that scene and a particularly short story in Ignorant Armies and why he keeps being drawn to that kind of
Yeah, and I
thing.
think
But
it's
but
definitely it's a much looser version of
mm,
chaos as like a thing. But again, I think that
yeah,
kind of works. I imagine, because especially now in Warhammer and in 40k, the gods of chaos and the armies that follow them are so like intensely designed and defined,
yeah, yeah,
because they had to make it into recognizable, consistent units that you can always feel, that are balanced or whatever, that turn up all the
true,
time. So we've ended up in a place where actually it's like very clearly, here's the guys who are always following Nurgle, here's the guys who are always following Khorne. Whereas back
yeah,
in the earlier days, and in a version of chaos that I personally find a little bit more interesting, there's a lot of give and take, and things are
hmm
weird. because it's chaos. It's not going to be well defined.
It's more about the condition of human weakness
Mm.
and giving in to indulgence and pleasure. And I mean, that's got parallels with religion, I suppose, in the way people with religion may see people without religion as ungodly, and it almost feels a little bit or more like that way when chaos is portrayed in that way, because the bad guys are the ones that have given into enjoyment. And that, again, that's covered in that chapter a little bit when they talk about that debate in chapter 13 about good and evil. And it's very, very interesting debate about good and evil. I don't know if we talked about this earlier in this or before we pressed record, but
we didn't talk about it.
But I think it's kind of linked to this conversation around chaos. It's quite a long conversation, and between Orfeo and Zaragoz, I keep pronouncing his name wrong, about what is good, what is evil, about almost questioning Orfeo and saying, well, what do you consider to be good? You need to question it and how small and insignificant we are in the grand scope of things. And it's this long, long conversation, which I thought was brilliant. I felt that it kind of was an odd place to put such a long conversation in the story. And I'm not sure whether it helped the flow. But it was good. But it absolutely ties in with that idea that chaos is something very, very different here than it is in later Warhammer.
So I like that conversation, and there's a couple of conversations between the evil wizard Semyaza and Orfeo, and one of the there's a trope. I don't know if it's a trope actually, but there's a thing that I really like in stories, in movies in particular, when you get the hero and the villain, the arch nemesis, they sit down together and have a conversation, and it's really civil and just. But they're on opposite sides of whatever the battle is, whatever the ideology is, whatever's happening, but they're still able to have like a civil conversation, and it just there's all the subtext. Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of that. I love it. You get it in the first X-Men movie with Magneto and with Professor X. You get it in Heat, probably the greatest example of it. It's in Sherlock Holmes' Game of Shadows, where Moriarty and Sherlock are able to sort of cut and thrust it early on when they're having a conversation, and I really like that as a thing. And you get that here, where Orfeo, now he fully knows all the sort of evils of Semyaza. He knows he's a bad guy. He knows he's involved with chaos. We're sort of progressing towards the end of the story, and he still goes in and has a conversation with Semyaza. And Semyaza, who could just kill him there and then, is actually like, let's talk about some of this stuff because we've got different philosophies, and I'm willing to have a conversation about it. And so I like that kind of thing. And
I enjoyed it. I
just
thought the pacing took me. I think it felt like the pace of the story was building at that point.
And
because that conversation was quite long and the chapter was quite long, I felt it lost a little bit of it.
Sure.
But I did like the conversation as well. So I don't know. I'm not saying it should be removed, but it did feel like it was kind of. But it's
almost an eye of the storm kind of thing, because you pace is building up, and then you have this moment of sort of calm in the center, and then you go into the finale, which is pretty chaotic.
I think maybe it's because so much of the book has elements where the pace is quite pedestrian. I mean, it felt like it was finally building towards the end. It just suddenly kind of step away from the precipice, should we say? It kind of then sort of okay, but like I said, and I've said it 300 times already in the last 5 minutes, I really enjoyed the conversation and I think it was worthwhile. But it was a strange thing to find in the story. Something you might imagine the characters having, but or a debate. Maybe they should do a podcast and talk about it there. But it felt an odd thing to include in such detail in a story of its length.
I mean, thinking about that, the climax that comes after that, and linking that back to what I was saying earlier on about anybody who worships chaos or does a deal with chaos deserves to be put down or taken out of power, and that's the sort of the driving principle for Arcangelo earlier on. He himself has done a deal with chaos in order to win, because that's the only way he could defeat Semyaza, that he could defeat this evil villain Marsilio who rules the city, is to sacrifice himself and his soul to chaos to get enough power to be able to take them all out. So there's a very interesting, like, I think that poses a very interesting philosophical point there of, well, actually, is it okay to use evil like chaos in order to defeat evil like chaos? Or are you
Yes.
just as bad as they are, or that kind of thing? So there's something interesting in that. But I mean, the conclusion is very dramatic, right? There's all sorts
Hmm.
of stuff going on. How did you find that sequence of events?
I, I felt like it was needed after the quite a slow story. It didn't need a big ending. Just quickly though, that conversation we've talked about maybe was needed to help set up that whole idea of
Sure.
Arcangelo being able to say, well, if I want to achieve my goals, I'm going to have to do something I don't want to do. And it opens up that gray area, or it gives
Mm.
a nod to what some guys was saying about what's good and evil, and that it's not as simple as good and evil, and the world's a bigger place. So maybe that kind of speaks to the decision he had to make, and almost makes that true. Yes, it's not good or evil. It's this one.
Yeah, it's a good point.
The human race has got choices to make, and it's a lot more complicated. But anyway, in terms of the big finish, I really liked it. It felt, again, not that Warhammery to start with. It felt more like you get your rats and you have your cloud, and it felt more like a spooky, evil horror, but almost, I suppose this takes you back to that sort of historical fantasy thing. It could have
Mm.
been a story about, we have an inquisitor of sorts, don't we, in terms of the chief of police. It felt like, we talked about it before, the whole story being sort of set in Spain. It felt like it'd almost be evil hidden within the Catholic Church, and you have this sort of rising devils and that kind of evil. It could
Mm.
almost be a Dan Brown story set in
Sure.
in middle-aged Spain or something. So again, it didn't scream Warhammer, because the prevailing physical evil you saw, apart from your white apes, which aren't very Warhammer, were just rats.
Mm.
A lot of them, but they were just
Sure.
rats. We're not talking Skaven here; they were just rats. So
There was
again,
quite a cool introduction to those, though, when Orfeo's put into like quite an interesting design for almost an oubliette, kind of thrown into
yeah,
this pit. Well, he's next to a pit and he's chained to the wall, and
yes,
there's other cells that are also open onto the pit, and there's another guy there who's been there for 5 years, and they can just hear the rats down in the center, in
yes.
the caves beneath the city. That was quite cool, and the sort of foreshadowing of these rats are going to come back at the end and be gross and
Yeah,
destructive
so
is
we
quite good.
knew there was this opening to evil under the
Yeah,
city, under the mountain. It's a hell pit, isn't it?
yeah,
It's almost a portal or an access to the underneath, the below, which again is brilliant. But if you were going to talk about it in the context of how it fits into Warhammer, which has been a prevailing theme, that isn't
mm,
necessarily Warhammer, because you could fit that narrative into anything that's
sure.
almost that kind of biblical horror, as well as you could into Warhammer.
Mm.
But I enjoyed it. But I would, you kind of almost expected some kind of demonettes or something to come out at that point and make it very Warhammer, and it didn't quite get
Yeah,
there.
which is interesting. So in the illustrated version, the first edition, like deluxe version they did, which has got some illustrations by Martin McKenna, when you see the sort of chaos at the end, there are minotaurs and beastmen and demonettes in that image. So
But they're not in the
they're more
story.
present, yeah, they're more present in the visuals for it than they are in the sort of explicit
I
narrative.
have no pictures in this edition. I mean, this hasn't really got anything to do with it
Yeah,
either.
I mean
But
that's from like battle
but
magic or yeah.
there's a couple of wizards in it. I know what we'll use. Saying that though, the blurb on the back didn't really have anything to do with the story. But it's, yeah, you're right. Having not, I wonder if I had the illustrated edition and whether my perception of how Warhammerish it was would be changed by the illustrations. Because when you're looking at something visual and you're reading a
Mm.
story, do you imagine things the way they're written, or just by the picture, or a mixture of both? Having just the prose, yeah, it, as I said, it really feel like that. It's still good though. I mean, and the end was good, but it, yeah, it could have been a little bit better if you there's some really, it feels like all I'm doing is saying, hey, you can make it more Warhammer, but there's some very, very, very subtle changes you could have added to the story
Yeah.
that could have made it much more Warhammer. A little bit of
How much do you
description
think
about,
that's... Sorry, go on.
no, a little bit more description about Zaragoz at the start, a few more about the regular people, maybe a few more patrons in the tavern that were
Yeah.
moaning about life and what it was like living under the evil, the evil duke with I don't know what the yokel Spanish accent would be, but complaining about, oh, we don't talk about him, he's evil kind of thing, we're scared of him, no one goes up there, kind of stay away from him. There's strange folk abroad, but it's that kind of thing, building that narrative into it, and then making the white monkey Skaven, and then adding some demonettes at the end. You're not really changing the story much at all, and something I don't think we'd have been having half the conversations we are now about it being Warhammer.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, one thing that I did think, and I didn't mention, but the actual city itself, Zaragoz, is built into this kind of mountainside, all these cliffside houses, and they do talk about the hierarchy of the city being that the higher up you live, the more well-to-do you are, basically.
Yes.
And that's largely
good.
The world building for the city. Again, there's some Ian Miller art of that is really, really nice and paints an amazing picture, like literally, of this, what the city looks like, and that makes it feel quite Warhammery to me. So I probably had an advantage there.
Yes.
But one thing that I thought was really nice about the city, and a sort of part of the magic of it, because there is subtle magic where we see like some lightning bolts, but most of the magic is kind of this more subtle version of Warhammer magic. Arcangelo the priest believes that the house of Cordova will be integral, essential to restoring justice to the city and to protecting the city. And what's quite cool about that is you don't know whether that's the literal physical house built into the rock, which has already played a role in previous coups, and people have like used it to move into the caves and go up into the fortress and things like that. So the physical location could be the house that plays a pivotal role, or it could be the family Cordova that are really pivotal. And that's why Rodrigo Cordova, the character that Orfeo is trying to protect and becomes friends with, is so important. I quite like that idea that there's a sort of, which one is it? How's it going to play out? In the end, it sort of turns out that it's both, actually, and that Rodrigo Cordova is the right person to take over from the villainous lord, and the house itself literally, physically protects people as this chaos horde or rats or whatever it is starts destroying stuff up in the fortress and things are falling down. The refugees they take refuge in the House of Cordova. So it fulfills both versions of that sort of thing. And I quite like that. I think that's a really
nicely
cool
done.
Yeah.
Nicely done. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that's where it's at, that this version of magic in this world, I think is done at its best, where there's these kind of subtle things. And because you also, the reason that it hasn't done anything so far, this house, and it hasn't protected Zaragoz up to this point, is because it needs to be activated. This sort of protective power needs to be activated in the first place. So Arcangelo, he basically gets himself trapped, and he gets the evil wizard Semyaza to do a spell in the house, and that turns it on, basically, and activates it so that it will protect people later on. So he gets trapped and captured, but it was on purpose. So he sort of does a bit of a Dark Knight Joker, and then he escapes from the cell and comes back later on before he does his sacrifice to chaos. Those kinds of elements of the plot, I think, work quite well, and those were like interesting little cogs that are turning and that make it quite interesting as it sort of moves forward. So there are some really cool things in it. I mean, like I say, overall, I quite enjoyed this as a book, and I probably not painted a picture of me enjoying it that much.
Yeah,
but I did enjoy it. I thought it came out as quite a good story, a different story than I expected, certainly, and maybe a different story than I wanted, even for this part of the Warhammer world. But overall, there are these cool ideas that are scattered through it and cool moments that did make me want to finish reading it and then to have enjoyed having read it, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we were talking there, I just looked across at the list of all the character names that I'd written down. I was reading it, and something that's quite apparent is that we haven't really talked about many of them.
Sure.
And I was thinking why, And it's because many of them are little more than a name and a description of who they were and what color their hair was. There's not a lot of depth to anyone, whereas the cast of characters in Drakenfels, even the more minor ones, had a little bit more to them. You learned a little bit about them, something that made you maybe care a little bit. But I don't know about you. I didn't find that I was overly concerned about what happened to any of the characters in some ways. Maybe even Orfeo.
Yeah,
because you knew Orfeo was going to be okay because he's part of a trilogy. But
and he's telling the story.
Yeah, so you know he's alive. You know he gets out, which you kind of do with stories anyway. That's nothing. That's not a new thing. But maybe that plays into that lack of jeopardy a little bit. But yeah, a lot of the other characters were kind of. Yeah, Rodrigo, you think he's a nice bloke. So you weren't sure when he first turns up in the tavern whether he's going to be a bit of a sort of a toff that turns his nose up at people, and there was an element of that to start with, but he turns out quite quickly to be a good bloke. But he's still, he not much beyond one dimension, and then the others are very, very basic. Morella's interesting. She's got an interesting character, and that's explored a little bit more. Even the Duke's not really exploring in very much depth for what
he's
is
barely in it.
essentially one of the
barely in it.
Yeah, he's a villain without any sort of impending doom or anything.
Yeah.
We haven't really talked about Skibera an awful lot, and he was kind of took the place of the villain a lot of the time because he was front and center. And I think that you felt like he was the number one enemy for a little while as kind of chief of police stroke inquisitor. He was a minister, wasn't he? Like a chief minister, I think was his title, working for the Duke. But he seemed to be working from the different side of things to Samaza. I don't know. He was an interesting character. Obviously, there was a torture scene, wasn't there, with Orfeo, which I don't know if he's now got 2 nipples less than Scaramanga, but it was interesting, and he felt like the one of the main bad guys, but he was obviously dispatched with this duel, wasn't he? Which is a little bit,
which was a cool scene, I thought. So they fight a duel between. So it's the least subtle and least secretive secret policeman you can imagine.
Yes.
He's telling everyone all the time that he's the leader of the secret police, but he just hates Orfeo for some reason, doesn't trust him, which ultimately is right not to trust him, but there's no real reason for him to be so untrusting of Orfeo. And actually, it might be what radicalizes Orfeo into action.
Yeah, I was going to say it's almost self-fulfilling.
Yeah.
By not trusting him, he created what Orfeo was, maybe.
But they have a very cool duel on a magic bridge, and it's a bridge that threatens to disappear any moment. But they have this one-to-one duel. The Duke allows it. It's quite a cool moment, and it's quite the geography of that fight is really well written, I think, as well. So it's quite dynamic, and you sort of really follow the action, and there's a real sense of threat to Orfeo in that moment, I thought. And Orfeo does some cool moves to actually to basically outfight his opponent using the geography to his advantage. And then Skibera, when he dies, it's a fascinating way of dying. Like he's stabbed and he falls off of this bridge into this chasm down below. And Brian Craig just has him, he literally says he makes no noise. He doesn't scream, he doesn't cry out, he just falls silently, even though he's still alive, just totally accepts his fate. I really liked that moment. I thought that was really good.
It was well written. The duel was fun. I did have elements of thinking of The Princess Bride at times, because it was I am Ingrid Montoya and now whatever the line is, but it was fun. It was well done, and maybe that's why when the pace seemed to be picking up at those moments, why I felt the shock with that kind of slower chapter again. But I think going back to that kind of, he was a really interesting character, and we hadn't really mentioned him because as part of the overall story arc, the most key elements of the story, he's on the periphery of it. He's there, he's creating some challenges along the way, but he's not a core part of the overall narrative. But he has more book time than the Duke does while doing that, which seems a little bit strange. It would be nice to have some scenes where the Duke was talking to people and there was planning, and you got that feeling of his 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 evilness, so to speak, or what he was about, rather than leaving it a little bit at a guess. What did
Mm.
you think of Orfeo?
Yeah, I actually quite liked him by the end. There's a So early on, people call him a minstrel, and he's like, "No, I'm not a minstrel. That is a term that should really be reserved for the wood elves. They raised me, and I've seen what that really means. I've seen the art of storytelling and
Mm.
music playing, and that kind of wins you over a little bit, I think, because he's humble, but
Mhm.
we know he is a good storyteller because he's telling all these stories. He's traveling the world doing it, and he certainly portrays himself in the story in a positive light. So there's always going to be that
Yes.
little bit of, is he, is he making himself seem really cool? Because there's a lot of stuff he does where he seems to be quite a suave sort of womanizer, or he's sort of quite noble at the right times, and he gets involved in the right ways. And I didn't really even want to be part of this, but I was drawn into the very center, the heart of the action. So there's some of that going on, I think,
Yeah.
but I was
Yeah.
willing to let it go because I quite liked him as a character. He portrays himself well.
Yes. I'm interested to find out more about him.
Yeah, I'll look
I
forward to
think
seeing him again, I think.
I'm hoping for more about. So we know a bit about his history. We know that he was brought up by wood elves, and so he's obviously got some worldview. Maybe some of his kind of almost educational level and worldview of being almost a bit superior, without, not to the point of
Sure.
rude. I'd say he's caring, but also feels himself to be above
Yeah.
many people. It's a bit when he's fleeing at the end and the young boy comes back. Doesn't he call him an idiot or something like that? He's quite abrupt with him, and it's kind of, it's just one line. It's not that important, but it's like you're trying to get the boy to run away. What are you doing here, idiot or fool or something? It's kind of,
Right.
I found it jarring. It's like, well, what's he speaking to him like that for? Because you get the impression he genuinely cares, and he does. Um, but yeah, I'd like that. I'd like that other side to him. I'd like to see. I'd be interested to see if that comes out in the other books. I don't think it will, but
No.
I like to. You get it with or you got Trick and Felix as an example. You get it with Felix quite a lot. His lack of confidence and his purpose, and the slightly darker side to his past, and always questioning whether he is a hero as much as Gotrek is, and for his deeds he clearly is, whereas Orfeo has clearly done some heroic deeds, and he knows it, and he tells you this kind of version of it. But it'd be nice to see that mirror sort of
Mm.
shattered at some point in the later stories, because there must be a more vulnerable side to him, must be
Yeah,
a darker side to him, or something or other.
because you're also won over to liking him because he's not the only survivor from the very start of the story. His ship having been attacked, it's him
Yeah,
and a cabin boy are both taken
Maro,
prisoner.
wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and he's going to tell this story to the Lord of the Twin Seas to win both his freedom and this other boy's freedom.
But
And
he wasn't
and
going to, was he? He didn't
well,
want
you
to
get you
help
get
the
it.
boy.
There's a certain amount of like, yeah, is he going to, or is he just going to sort of save himself? But it also, there seemed to me to be a very, it's there that, oh, of course he's going to do the right thing, and
Yes, and he does
ultimately,
want to, but that initial bit, doesn't he? Because the boy asks for his help, and
yeah, and
he,
he's like, I
before
don't
he
want to
can
say
say
anything.
no, the door opens. So it felt like he almost accidentally fell in. Oh, I'm gonna have to
Yeah,
help him now.
which I guess
So again,
is
that maybe that is his character. Maybe
yeah.
that is it. He's kind of, he's a big
There
deal and he
was
knows it.
one thing in Orfeo's storytelling that I really liked, which is when he refers to other stories he's told. He doesn't fully tell them, but he mentions a story about three brothers who were each given magical artifacts, and they were cursed magical artifacts, and they went off on
Yes.
quests, and they each intersect in each other's quests and use their magical artifacts to save the other from their curses and all this sort of stuff. It sounds like a really good story, and I'd love to
Yes.
know if it's based on something real. Well,
Yes.
another story from someone else. I mean, is
Mm.
like, and has Brian Craig gone, oh, I'll make a Warhammer version of that story, because he does the same thing with the 1001 Nights, where that's referenced in
Yeah.
as a Warhammer story as well. So
whether it's a known fable somewhere or
yeah, because it feels like it would be the kind of thing that a questing knight would do, and
Mhm.
it would turn up in some medieval fiction somewhere. Three brothers with magic items. The
Yeah, I was
Deathly
going to say, I wonder
Hallows
if you'll
comes to
find it's
mind,
some
of
kind of
course, as
German
well.
folk story or
Yes,
something like that.
absolutely that kind of thing. Yeah, and I assume it's the kind of story that many authors have drawn inspiration from. If it's real, or is it just a Brian Craig invention that's pretty cool? So
Yes.
yeah, I thought that was good. And there was one other character as well who I did think had a good little arc, very brief, but I did care about him, and that's Falcaro, who is the other
Mhm.
prisoner that Orfeo encounters. He also gets freed when the wizard Arcangelo turns up and he frees Orfeo and he frees this other prisoner, and he's been there for 5 years in this prison next to this pit of hell and rats and stuff, and he's completely wasted away, but he's given like an amulet to give him strength, and he's got sort of power again. And he instantly, as much as he's very desperate to be freed, he's instantly back on his quest. So he was originally brought to the city to protect this princess, who we haven't talked about at all because it's so incidental to the rest of the plot. But that's
Yeah.
the reason that this guy's there, and he's been captured and he's been kept there. And the wizard asks for his help. And even though he's completely wasted away, he's like, yeah, let's do it. So he gets involved and he tries to save the princess. He runs off ahead. He's carrying the princess down into these caves. Orfeo has that cool duel with Scabera on the bridge. And then when Orfeo catches up to him, he's been
Yeah.
killed because the princess they thought they were saving is actually the chaos sorcerer, Morella, who had done an illusion spell on herself to look like the princess. And
Yeah.
it's
Which
such
was
a
a cool
small,
moment.
yeah, it's a great moment. It's a great little twist. And I felt really bad for him as a character because
Yeah, very unlucky for him.
it's so rough. It's so rough. You just like, oh man, this
I'm
is
free.
brutal.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, and then he even, I think the final words he has to Orfeo is like, did we save the princess or something like that? Or, did I do my job sort of thing? And I know, I think Orfeo gives him like that, yeah, we did sort of thing. But it is rough with that guy. So I think that Brian Craig can definitely do good little characters and great little scenes like that, and sort of really impactful moments for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, he's not a forgettable character, but he's not in it for very, very
No,
long.
very brief.
Um, but yeah, it is a bit unlucky for him. I felt like he could have done more with the story at that point. It would have been really interesting if it wasn't Morella, if it actually was the princess and
Well,
that
that's why I
she
wondered
was
it might go in that direction. Yeah.
in league with them, and maybe Arcangelo was the evil. I thought of that one moment. I thought maybe Orfeo's on the wrong side here. Maybe the Duke is good, and the reason they were also concerned was because Arcangelo and this princess were actually evil, and that's why they were kept her captive. And I thought that, oh, that's where it's going to go, and it obviously it didn't, but it would have been an interesting twist, double twist, I suppose it would have been.
Yeah, that would have been cool. Yeah, that would have been an interesting way to go. But I think ultimately so obviously you get this sort of Deus Ex Chaotica, or Arcangelo has given up his soul to get chaos to save the day. It's quite abrupt, really. Like you have this very cool build up to what is this festival that happens in Zaragoz, the Night of Masks. There's another good duel, I thought, where Rodrigo, totally outmatched by the evil Duke. The Duke's about to kill him, about to kill Orfeo as well. And then these rats and the chaos all comes in and sort of saves the day, which I think is an interesting perspective that we don't often see in the Warhammer world, where chaos are the cavalry almost. And you sort of, it does end the story more or less there. Orfeo's like, right, well, Rodrigo's safe and he's going to choose who he's going to marry, and that's going to change the fate of Zaragoz. But I don't know what he did because I left straight away. And then we go back to his prison cell where he's sort of telling this story to the Lord of the Twin Seas, who's captured him and wanted to find out the history of Zaragoz. And that's where we get the sort of final twist, which is that the reason he was interested in Zaragoz was because it turns out Semyaza, the evil wizard, was his brother. That's what he wanted to know about. And I mean, what were your thoughts on that sort of moment of that as a revelation? Was that a satisfying twist in the tale?
just briefly before the revelation moment, when you say about chaos saving the day, I suppose in some ways it is chaos practically, but it's also Arcangelo saving the day, isn't it? By his sacrifice,
Mm.
that his power has almost by becoming evil, he's able to do good, and it's his goodness. Before, do you see what
I
you're
do
with
get
me
what you
there?
mean, but
That
I guess
trigger wouldn't have happened to defeat, to almost awaken those chaos gods to go back and take their revenge on the people that have been worshipping them. So
yeah,
so
I suppose
yes,
my
it was chaos, and chaos is fickle, and it does what it wants. And something we've learned with all of these books so far, all three of them so far, is that dabble in chaos and it will come back and bite you. But to answer your actual question, I kind of expected something like that. You knew he was going to be related right from the beginning. You knew he was going to be related to one of the main protagonists. It's just which one. It could have easily have been Rodrigo. That's why I thought it was going at one point. I thought he'd be Rodrigo's brother, and it will be. But yeah, it didn't feel like a huge revelation. It felt expected. You expected him to agree to release Orfeo. None of that was a surprise, and I didn't want it to be any different to that. That's a nice way to end the story.
Mm.
If it was, yes, I will let you go, but I'm going to kill Maro the boy just because I didn't like your story. That would have felt a bit weird, but I think it's entirely what I expected. I didn't really give it any more thought, really. There was a little bit of chat on the stream when they about whether he was sorry that his brother had been killed or not.
yeah,
I think it was covered. I think it was covered when I think the last line or two, when he kind of almost said under his breath, but he was my brother. I think that was almost him accepting that, yeah, he was a bloke, but he was my brother, so I'm sad, but yeah, he probably deserved it.
yeah, and I think
That's why I
in
interpreted it. So
yeah, absolutely, and yeah, it's not a big sort of surprise, but structurally, it sort of felt like that was supposed to be a little bit of something more. Um, but it worked.
yeah,
It was fine.
it
Yeah,
was.
I think you're right. It was the
I
right
thought
ending.
those bits were the most predictable bits in the story. They're the most standard story arc tropes that you would have guessed. I don't know
Yeah.
that that's the bit I guessed right from the sort of the prologue in the beginning, and you I guess that you knew there was a connection. I guess he's going to be connected to either the evil side or the good side there. And I probably guessed the evil side. I thought that maybe he's been banished or left because he didn't agree with what they were doing or whatever. And maybe that was the case. We're left with that tale untold.
I did quite like the idea, though, that so Orfeo kind of second guesses himself when he discovers this fact that Semyaza was his brother, because then he's like, "Oh no, I painted Semyaza as too evil a character," and have I,
Oh God.
and it sort of it made me wonder there again. Does Orfeo put more embellishments in? Does he make the characters a bit more dramatic for the purposes of his own storytelling? And I quite liked that as a little character moment for Orfeo as well.
He mentions early on, doesn't he, before he starts telling the story, that he was nervous about how to tell the story and what emphasis to put. He would have liked to have known which house that Nassim,
yeah,
Al-Qadi. There we go. I know the first name.
Nazreen.
Nazreem. I looked up at my notes and I realized they've been auto-corrected to something else. It doesn't say Nazreem anymore, but yeah, he knew that there was a potential jeopardy there, that if he pitched the story wrong anyway, he'd be in more danger. So again, I think that built towards that you knew that was going to be a thing right at the end.
So, I mean, because that is a good point. That idea that there's a writer, an author, who's trying to pitch the story in a certain way. So that's what Orfeo wants to do. He can't do it. That's why he says I'm going to have to stick close to the truth here because I don't know which way my audience wants me to go. That's again a certain amount of comparison with Drachenfels, where we had an author trying to tell a story, trying to find the most dramatic perspective on the events that did take place in the history of the Warhammer world. It does invite a bit of comparison. They're very different stories, but there are certain elements that do, for me at least, they do bring to mind, okay, this same theme or this kind of same point was tackled in a very different way in Drachenfels. Are you overall in favor of one book over the other, Drachenfels or Zaragoz?
Very clearly, yeah, Drachenfels, and enjoyed it on many levels, much more. But yeah, there were elements of this book that reminded me of some of the bits I liked in Drachenfels, but I felt that it was done much better in Drachenfels and more often. And the pace was right throughout the whole thing. It built right, even though it was unusual. It wasn't a standard sort of story arc, and we talked about that quite a lot. There are still things, I think, on reading this, you think, well, you could have changed that, you could have did this here. Bits we've already mentioned, where it was Drachenfels, though there were bits when I was reading it, I thought I didn't know where this is going. By the end of it, you know, I wouldn't change it. It's good. It does it right. The author knew what he was doing all the way through. Whereas I do feel with this one, it was a little bit more along the lines of, I've got some words. I sound really harsh. It feels like I had some numbers to hit. I've got a basic outline of a story I can tell, and I can set it in Spain, and then I can look at these few pages in Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, and explore chaos a little bit, because I've probably been told that chaos is the main theme. Chaos is the theme, isn't it, for Warhammer at that time in many ways. So chaos is he's the main overarching bad guy. So yeah, I think it's fine. I feel like being really bad. What I don't want to do is, you know, get through all these books and they're all kind of gushing, because I love it. Because I don't love it, and I'll probably never read it again. But I really enjoyed reading it, and some parts of it I thought were very good and very well written.
Yeah.
Some parts I would scratch my head a little bit about why decisions were made. So I tend to switch to the logical rather than the kind of artistic view on it. And the logical side of it is that he was paid to write a book, and it feels like that he didn't know the setting in the same way as the authors of the game would do at that point, and that's very normal and natural. And I don't know if he loved the setting, shall we say? Whereas you read Bill King and you know he loves the setting, and that comes through in the story. Whereas this maybe felt like a writing job, whereas Drachenfels felt like King Newman maybe did start to really enjoy the setting and the story he could tell within that setting, and using the setting as a device to tell a very interesting story.
Yeah. And I think that love can be seen that he still writes or has written those characters many times later as well. Yeah, I think I largely agree. I think I maybe am a bit more favorable in my opinion overall of the novel. I think ultimately I enjoyed it more than I thought I was going to halfway through. By the time I was done, I did like it, and I did enjoy it. I do totally agree in terms of the comparisons to Drachenfels. I think that's just so far above in terms of quality. I think Drachenfels is really set high bar that's going to be tough for the rest of these books to meet. But I also was worried that because that bar was so high coming off of Drachenfels, that the rest of them were going to feel really bad. And I didn't think that this did. I thought this was a good, fun story. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed what the elements that were within it. That there was some cool stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know that I would rush to reread it anytime soon. But I am looking forward to the next Orfeo story. So I think that's probably the best result that we could have got for me.
I should clarify. I mean, I've read worse stories that are Warhammer fiction that would fit into that bolter porn or sword and board porn kind of era of the 2000s and the noughties that were kind of just terrible stories that are all about getting to the next fight and describing the fight, and then they're mind-numbingly boring. I won't mention any of them, and they're not good stories. This was a nice story, well written mostly. So it's not, that isn't my criticism of it. It's not a bad novel. It's how it fits in with the context of both things. So it's well above many other very bad Warhammer novels. It's not a bad Warhammer novel. It's just an unusual one. And as we said the last time, of its time, and the context of the way it was written, who was asked to write it, and for what reason and what brief they were given and the experience. So it's hugely important.
So overall then, as we always do now, was this a thumbs up or a thumbs down for Zaragoz?
Oh, that's a difficult one, actually. And I kind of want to I'm going to give it a thumbs up because I don't think it's a shocker, and I think we may find a shocker or two in this series. I've got a feeling we might find one, at least, or individual short story may turn out to be a shocker. So I'm not. I would feel it would be harsh to give it a thumbs down.
Yeah.
For the reasons I've just said about thinking about it within
Yeah.
the context it was written.
I'm
It's
thumbs
still
up.
a good story.
Yeah, I'm thumbs up all the way because I think there's enough interesting stuff in there, and I agree. There's definitely going to be worse stories for sure, but I enjoyed this one. I thought this was a good one.
Yeah, people should go out and read it and experience it. Definitely, it's not something I'll say just don't waste your time with. And if we're going on a on a very binary kind of a thumbs up or thumbs down kind of rating system, then yeah, it has to be a thumbs up.
Well, and next time we're going to be doing another anthology because it's Wolf Riders, which is coming up, the second anthology of Warhammer Fantasy stories. So that's 8 more short stories set in the Warhammer world. I've got no idea whether this one's going to be good. There's a whole wide range of different authors, different stories, different subjects. So we could be in for a really great book or a mixed bag again.
Or no book.
Yeah, it's tough to get hold of this one.
They're tough to get hold of at the moment. I still haven't secured my copy. So if there is anyone watching this that has a spare copy they would like to sell or lend or something like that, I'm struggling at the moment. I think I found one from Australia with shipping would be about 70 or 80 pounds. So I'd rather not spend that for a book that maybe might not be worth that in terms of my affection for it.
And there is a good backup for this one coming up as well.
There is.
So anybody who can't get hold of Wolf Riders, but who wants to listen to the stories before we do our next book club in November, the Oldhammer Fiction podcast has already recorded all 8 of those stories that are in the book. So you can go and listen to each of those. Lewis has done some really fantastic recordings of those different stories. I'll put the link to that in the description as well, so people can go and listen to that ahead of when we get together to chat.
That's my backup.
November. Yeah, absolutely. Great stuff. Well, Stu, thank you again for joining me on the GW Books Club. I thought it was another fantastic conversation and a very interesting read. So a success overall, I think.
Absolutely. Pleasure doing it. Really good fun.
Where can people find you before we go, Stu?
Miniature Realms. You'll pop a link in the description for
I will.
Yeah, Miniature Realms on all social medias now, because I'm on Blue Sky as well, thanks to you. But all social medias, but mostly check out the YouTube channel, Miniature Realms. So lots of painting stuff and loads of Warhammer Old World stuff coming up.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I agree. Go and follow Stu on every social media platform, and also follow me at Jordan Sorcery on every social media platform as well, please. That would be great. Just chatting nonsense about pop culture and gaming stuff all the time. So without further ado then, thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.